Now it's time to bring in our guest host for the hour, Stephen Rattner. Of course, Rattner, the former managing director of Quadrangle Asset Management. He's handled the personal and philanthropic finances of New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg, whom Mr. Rattner supported through his chairmanship of Democrats for Bloomberg during the 2005 re-election campaign. Michael Bloomberg is majority owner of Bloomberg LP, parent of Bloomberg News. Did I get all that correct?
I think so.
I got like something. Well, we got to do this. We got to tell people.
Absolutely.
We talked about IBM today on radio, and folks, this is important. I said I'm a modest shareholder of IBM.
I heard that.
Because people should know that. Here's the book, Overhaul. Let's talk autos here. Excuse me, just for a little bit. An insider's account. Where are we in the auto industry? Are you happy?
I'm happy but not thrilled. The auto industry, I think the restructuring went perfectly. It did everything we intended to do. The companies are doing incredibly well. GM had its IPO, car sales were trending up, and then we hit, no pun intended, the bump in the road last month with auto sales as part of the overall slowdown of the economy. And that's not perfect, but I still believe auto sales are going to continue to trend up. And I just want to say one more thing,
please,
so everyone knows, even though it's not a public company, Chrysler, Sergio Marchionne and Fiat bought out the remaining U.S. stake in Chrysler. And of the $12 billion that were invested by both President Bush and President Obama, the government is going to get back all but about $1.2 billion of that. And we saved for that tens or hundreds of thousands of jobs.
Dreaded first chart counts them for Ford. Ford didn't take advantage of this. Right. Here it is. Look down here, Steve. You can see it on the big screen. Rattner considers 166,000 paychecks. I mean, this is not the pressure you faced or camera guy Victor faced. This is the pressure that President Bush and President Obama faced. Just Ford is 166,000 bodies.
And that's exactly the point. It's not 166,000 jobs. It's not 266,000 jobs. There are 2.25 million people who work in the auto sector who would have, at least for a time, lost their jobs had these companies not been saved by President Bush and by President Obama. And then all the spill out from there would have occurred. So the people who say, well, we should have left this to the market, we should have had a regular Chapter 11, honestly, they don't know what they're talking about. The only alternative would have been liquidation of these two companies, and then Ford would have shut down, the suppliers would have shut down, and we would have had devastation.
Bring up auto sales here, and then we'll move on. We got too much to talk about today. We got chart 2, I think it is, Rex here, car sales. So I've got it labeled. There it is. The overhaul continues, working off of the shameless plug for the Rattner book, Total Vehicle Sales. That yellow line is the average of that middle glory in the 2000s, 17 million units. How do you frame a proper production number? Where should we be going to?
The way to think about this is that we need to sell 15 million cars a year in this country simply to replace the cars that get scrapped every year and the number of new drivers who come in. For the past 2 years, for the first time in the history of the automobile, the scrappage rate was greater than the new car sale rate, meaning that there were fewer cars on the road at the end of each of those 2 years. That's not a long-term sustainable model. So I firmly believe that if not immediately, over the near term, car sales will go back to the 15 million range. When and if they go back to 16 or 17 million, I don't know. But at 15 million car sales, GM and Ford will make record profits because of the restructurings that they've been through. A
headline just coming across, Goldman Sachs elects Barnard College's president to their board. You've talked to a lot of boards. What does that signal? They ask an academic to come on the board. Is she going to be looking at credit default swaps?
Well, as a matter of fact, they, until recently, Goldman had the president of my alma mater, Brown, Ruth Simmons, on the board, and she stepped down because she felt the time involved was too much of a conflict with her academic responsibilities. No, I don't think they expect people like Ruth Simmons or the Barnard president to look at CDSs. I think they want them there to help Goldman assess their broader standing in the community, their social responsibility, and whether they're being good corporate citizens.
I think it's fair. Marianne Keller sent me in a love note because she knew you were going to be on. She's looking for some engineering expertise on the new GM board. Are you pleased with the makeup of the new Detroit, the leadership of the new Detroit?
Well, since I selected most of them, I hope I am, yes, and I'm not being facetious. Look, what we wanted when we put that board together was a board of serious former CEOs and private equity guys. We did not feel GM had the luxury to have academics or other people from other walks of life, and that's what we got. We have the former CEO of Burlington Northern, the former CEO of Alcatel-Lucent, Ed Whitaker, of course, from AT&T, David Bonderman from TPG, and a really, really strong Steve Gursky was put on by the UAW, and then Dan Akerson, of course, we put on the board initially from Carlyle before he became CEO of the company.
Stephen Rattner with us as our guest host today because we can talk autos, we can talk finance later with Brad Hintz and Charles Peabody. The nostalgia of manufacturing. I remember seeing you walk by me with your retinue in the Renaissance Center. Bring up this chart. This is a chart of the day I did 9 years ago. The nostalgia of manufacturing, the Renaissance, the past. This is manufacturing jobs compared to the population of the United States back to the land of Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind. You can see the boomlet on the left side, which is World War II, and then somewhat stability as our productivity improved. And Steve Rattner, we've just rolled over. Do we need a public policy to enhance manufacturing?
Look, the first thing that we have to understand is that for a developed country, manufacturing as a percent of what goes on in the country is almost inevitably going to go down over time, and I'm not even sure that's a bad thing. We have replaced manufacturing with many other kinds of businesses, whether it's financial services, whether it's Silicon Valley, that are good jobs, they're high-paying jobs, they're growth industries. This is the modern world, and this we should accept. So I think there are things we should do for manufacturing, but I don't think we should commit unnatural acts to save manufacturing because that will not be economically productive.
Do you believe in a manufacturing multiplier, that it's a better job than a service sector job?
Absolutely not. I mean, it depends what kind of service sector job, but if you're saying, yes, is a job at Facebook better than a job at some auto supplier in Ohio, I think a job at Facebook is frankly better probably in the long run because those are growth areas, and there's nothing wrong with those kind of jobs. There's absolutely nothing wrong with those kind of jobs.
You spent a lot of time in Michigan. Do we risk a depeopling of our manufacturing geographies?
We have a lot of adjustments, and government could play a much more constructive role in those adjustments. But let me give you an example of why I don't think that having full focus on manufacturing as our salvation is right. We're in a global world. We cannot compete in basic manufacturing against other countries where they do it cheaper. VW is bringing a plant to Chattanooga, Tennessee, in which they're going to pay $14.50 an hour, which is half of what a UAW worker gets in Michigan. $14.50 an hour is $30,000 a year. These are not great jobs. This is not the manufacturing jobs that you think of in the past. Look at a country like Germany. Germany, where I spent 5 days a few months ago to understand this. Germany is incredibly successful in manufacturing. Why? Because they produce products that are not commodity products. They produce products that either have enormous brand appeal, BMW, Mercedes, and so forth, or they produce machine tools and very specialized products that other countries can't compete with as easily.
Two charts. Let's do too much information right now. Single series here, and it is EU employment. I've never looked at this chart. There it is. EU employment back to the mid-90s, up it goes, it rolls over, and even a little recover there with all the challenges in the periphery. Politics is about jobs. Do you perceive in your trip to Germany a different politics about employment there versus here? Is it a given right to have a job in Europe?
Germany actually went in the opposite direction. Germany had that kind of approach, and it led to a lot of stagnation in the 90s and the early 2000s. And German policy moved in what I would consider the right direction. Much less government intervention, much less regulation, more of a safety net for people who lost their jobs, which is entirely appropriate, and a kind of grand bargain with business in which they gave business the freedom to go out and compete, and it worked very well for Germany.
Excuse me, here's the same chart. Here it is. And we've overlaid over it, it's an elegant chart, U.S. jobs. So there's that white line of Europe. We did better, normalized back to 1995. We did better. And then there's how we have cleared our employment market. We're a little harsher, aren't we?
We are harsher, or you could call them more flexible labor markets. You know perfectly well.
When you have a suit and tie on, it's more flexible.
You know well that there's a yin and a yang between jobs and productivity. Right. Unless you get strong productivity growth, you have no growing economy. We have had very strong productivity growth. That's actually good news. The disappointment is that jobs have not come along with it, and that the growth in that productivity has not been shared with workers. Really about the first time that we've gone through a recovery with productivity growing and the workers getting zero. We have had 7 quarters of recovery in which workers' wages have not gone up after inflation by a penny. First time in our history.
With that said, and as an investor, do you use U.S. corporations as a global proxy, or do you choose to go abroad and buy foreign companies?
Well, first of all, as an investor, this is actually good news. It's bad news for workers, which is where my heart is. But
I get those letters, as I'm sure you do too.
It's good news for profits, which are at a record. We've come through this recession. Profits for the S&P, as you well know, are now at a record, even though you have all these people without jobs and all this terrible problem in the U.S. Something like 70%, maybe a bit less, of the S&P's revenues come from outside the U.S. So you can buy the big multinational U.S. companies like Coca-Cola or whatever and get a lot of non-U.S. exposure. But we believe that having a globally diversified portfolio, both in terms of accessing the faster growth that I think will continue in Asia, notwithstanding these bumps in the road, as well as balancing your currency risk by having exposure in these other countries, is the prudent way to invest.
IBM 100th anniversary, I believe it's today. We did a bit on that in Bloomberg Surveillance this morning. It signals that companies have to be flexible.
Totally. Yeah, and look at IBM as a precise example of what we were just talking about. IBM has gone from a company that mostly made things to a company that mostly services things. The same is true of Xerox. These are companies that have adapted to the modern world and recognize that they cannot compete making PC boards in the U.S. and competing against people in Asia. And so they've become a service company, and an extraordinarily successful service company, as you know.
A phrase knocking around, thank you, Dan Clifton, at Strategas, is stimsterity. Alistair Darling talked about this last week with me in London. We've got to get this stimulus up front, and then we've got to have that austerity background in the backdrop. What is the Rattner formula mixing these two, this oil and water together?
If any of us could be God, whether it's you, me, Roger Altman.
Victor, my camera guy's God. Other than that, it's limited.
And frankly, Victor could do a better job than the people who are doing it now in Washington.
Thank you. He agrees. Matthew just went, yes.
Because, and that's praising him with not a lot of, damning with faint praise, whatever. Yeah. But look, the fact is that in Washington obviously is complete gridlock. They don't know what they're doing. There's no thoughtfulness about the plan. If you were designing a plan, you would have more short-term stimulus. You would do things on the payroll tax for employers. You would do targeted jobs credits, because we do need to get people back to work. But you would couple it with really tough stuff in the out years. 2 years from now, we got to get this budget deficit under control. That would be the yin and the yang that you would try to do on the budget if you were God. But you're not God, and Joe Biden isn't even God, and he's sitting
Really?
there. No, he's
it's
not
a break
God.
exclusive. Steve Rattner says the vice president is not a God.
He's a great guy, but he's not God, and he can't get this done the right way, and so it's going to be a jerry-rigged patchwork of measures. I don't think there's any, frankly, that much danger that we're going to overreact and cut the budget too soon, too quickly. But it's not going to be perfect.
Consumers held us up. We've shown that chart this week. Here's Steve Roach. Bring it up here. Note of the day. Morgan Stanley, I believe this was in the FT as well. Like Japan, Washington policymakers are fostering zombie congestion by attempting to forestall economic adjustments through QE2, foreclosure containment, and debt forgiveness. I mean, you were in the heart of this, solving Detroit. Are we trying to have a pain-free crisis?
I also watched my colleagues in the Treasury try to do all the things that Steve Roach talked about. I think he could. I like Steve Roach a lot. In this case, I think he could not be more wrong. I think that the kinds of things that the government was trying to do, whether it was QE2, foreclosure relief, things like that, what we did with the car companies, I cannot even imagine what would happen to this economy without that. You know as well as I do, people like to deride the stimulus program that was passed in January of '09, but serious economists, people like Alan Blinder and Mark Zandi, have studied this, and without that stimulus program, unemployment would be well in the double digits today.
Dr. Blinder was on a few days ago. We alluded to that study. He's right now focused on housing. He says it's absolutely critical that we move housing forward. Do we need a policy to clear once and for all the housing market?
Desperately. Look, housing, by every measure, housing prices have fallen enough so that on a rent equivalent basis, they shouldn't fall anymore.
Correct.
Right? So, but they're continuing to fall because you have a supply-demand imbalance. We need to clear that. Now, the tough thing is, how do you clear that in a way that's fair to people? Is it fair to bail somebody out who got overextended because they weren't prudent? Meanwhile, their neighbor is struggling to make their own mortgage payments, but they were prudent. There are a lot of moral questions around this. There's moral hazard questions around it. But right now, we have no housing policy, and nobody's focused on a housing policy. And so the housing market will continue to be under pressure until we do something.
Let's come back. Thoughts with Stephen Rattner here, my guest host for the hour. Steve, just a remarkable time, and I want to go back to what we're really talking about here. Here's a chart. We haven't shown it in a while on stimsterity, which I love. Thank you, Dan, for that, Dan Clifton. Fed assets, do you have confidence they can unravel QE2?
I think the bigger question, or more immediate question, whether they can unravel QE2 is what happens when QE2 stops. When QE1 stopped, as you recall, the market went down rather precipitously.
Right.
And with QE2 coming out, the question is, will the same thing happen? And what will also happen to the value of assets that they had been buying, treasuries and so forth? I think eventually they can unravel QE2 and get their balance sheet down. But the bigger question, as I said, is what happens at the end of QE2? And of course, you're now, amazingly, in some respects, starting to hear people talk about QE3 and whether we need a QE3 or not.
I need you to write an op-ed about Peter Diamond. My job is not to give my opinion. I rarely do. You have had many, many jobs in your career. A lot of people don't know that. I just can't agree with the idea that a PhD of that extinguished characteristics can't be on the Fed when by tradition we have multiple job sets on the Fed. Your thoughts on the Nobel laureate being turned down?
I think it's appalling. I think it's absolutely appalling. The guy was clearly qualified to be on the Fed, and I think this whole confirmation process works to the detriment of our country. As you know, virtually all the regulatory agencies at the moment have acting heads of the financial regulatory agencies because the administration is afraid to propose people because the Senate has basically made clear they're not going to confirm them. I've never met Elizabeth Warren. I don't know if I would pick her to head the Consumer Protection Bureau, but she's clearly qualified. It was her idea. The president wanted her, and the idea that she cannot get confirmed and he cannot get a person in there he wants who's qualified, I think is wrong. I think it's an appalling way to run a railroad. One
of the best things about your book is the vignettes, the moments within the architecture of the White House. Give us one moment under tension of how the Oval Office runs within this administration.
Well, as I wrote in my book, the really toughest decision was Chrysler and whether we should save Chrysler or not. And the president really, to his credit, spent the time, drilled down on these issues, much different issues than he'd ever worked with before, ever expected to. And it was interesting because it was a decision-making process like the best of what happens in the private sector, where people air all their points of view and then the president decides, and in that case, he got it right.
I could go on in like another 2 hours here just with a general conversation. Thank you so much. Generous of you to come by today.